Hey, this is Enaa in with you in the fight, and for today's review, I'm going to be doing Edmund Wilson, To the Finland Station. Anyway, this is a great book. It was written in 1940 by Edmund Wilson, a cultural critic who lived from the 1890s to about 1972. And boy, can he write. To the Finland Station is about pretty much the history, the ideas that lead up to when Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Party, arrives in the Finland Station in 1917 and pretty much leads the Russian Revolution. To the Finland Station is divided into three parts. Part 1 deals with French historians like Jules Michelet, Anatole France, Taine, and others. Part 2 deals with the utopian socialists, the conspiracy of equals, and Marx and Engels. Part 3 deals with Lenin and Trotsky. And the truth is, Edmund Wilson is a fantastic writer. He does have some high-blown rhetoric, and that can be a little putting off if you're not used to it. But the truth is, I don't mind too much because he does make you think, he does challenge you, and if we're not challenged and we're just simplified, we get the bourgeois claptrap of Fox News and MSNBC, who just dumb everything down for us. So, To the Finland Station definitely takes us through the gauntlet of ideas that lead up to the Bolshevik triumph. However, I do have some problems with the book, and I'll lay them out for you. Although Edmund Wilson spent 6 years researching and writing this book, he learned German and Russian, he read 1,000 books to prepare for it, and despite the fact that he was a sympathizer of communism and Trotskyism, he even defended Leon Trotsky from the charges of the Moscow trials, he doesn't really have a good grasp of Marxism, despite the fact of his wide reading. And here's why. Edmund Wilson doesn't accept Marxism as scientific socialism. He thinks it's more of a moral critique of capitalism, and he puts Marx in the tradition of great Judaic prophets. And he thinks that Marxism is rather deterministic, and we're going to get to socialism inevitably regardless. So although he praises Marx as a moral critic of capitalism, he doesn't put much validity in a lot of Marxian concepts. And here are two that definitely get neglected in Wilson's book. Number one, the labor theory of value. The labor theory of values pretty much tells us why you're exploited on the job, why the boss gets rich. It's laid out in Das Kapital, Volume 1, and Wage, Labor, and Capital by Marx. Edmund Wilson does discuss it, but he ultimately finds it untenable. And as a Marxist, I'm going to object, because the labor theory of value explains why you're exploited on the job and why the boss gets rich. And Marx pretty much tells us that's got to go. And based on my own experience on the job, I agree, and so should you. Another concept that Wilson doesn't really deal with adequately is dialectics. In fact, his chapter on dialectics is called The Myth of the Dialectic. He looks at the dialectic as simply thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. This is a rather simplistic view of the dialectic, and is really not one Marx much ascribed to. In fact, if you want a better picture of the dialectic, aside from reading Marx's own writings, I'd recommend Bertil Ohlmann's Dance of the Dialectic. And furthermore, although Wilson spends a great deal of time talking about French historians, and this goes to his problem with the dialectic, he doesn't really talk about Hegel at all. That's right, Hegel, the German idealistic philosopher, who was a formative influence on Marx. Whether or not we accept the Louis Althusser idea that there is a great break between Marx and Hegel, the scant treatment of Hegel is pretty much scandalous. Hegel deserves a great deal more than he's discussed here. And furthermore, when you read Das Kapital, any of the volumes, you know that Marx was intimately familiar with Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Malthus, and other classical economists. Guess what? Wilson doesn't really talk about them. Now, that's fine, but if you're talking about the influences of Marx and Engels, I would probably put classical political economy before Jules Michelet, but that's just me. And furthermore, he's ultimately hostile to Lenin and Trotsky, and he doesn't really much distinguish between the various currents of communism, whether we're talking about Trotskyism, Stalinism, or various left forms of communism. And for someone who had been on the periphery of these movements, that's kind of a failing here. And just to point, and again, Wilson says that Marxism is a deterministic philosophy, and this pretty much goes against the grain of pretty much everything Marx and Engels said. If you read his writings on France, men make history, but not in the circumstances they choose. The German ideology goes into this. The end of the inaugural address of the First International says, the emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class itself, which means self-emancipation. That is human intervention in history. We emancipate ourselves as the proletariat from the shackles of capitalism. Marx is telling us there's going to be a struggle. He doesn't tell us how it's going to end. That definitely leaves it open to human intervention and choice. You read the introduction, the beginning of the Communist Manifesto. Class struggles can end either with a higher form of production or the common ruin of the contending classes. Despite all this, despite my many criticisms of Edmund Wilson, he's a fantastic writer. And you would be hard-pressed to find a more enjoyable book to spend an afternoon, or many afternoons as it would be. Although there are better biographies of Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky out there, Wilson is a great writer and a great historian. Take him with a grain of salt, but definitely take him. This is Enaa, in with you in the fight back. Till next time.